This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 852 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. As I mentioned last week, this 15 transaction show, it's a little bit different at the end of the fantasy season. Rather than giving you buy and sell transactions, I'm just focused on adds and drops. So every transaction that you hear is solely about the waiver wire. That's because trade deadlines have passed. With that being said, let's get to the first transaction of the week. Add Ty Chandler. So a lot of the transactions that I talked about last week, they're still applicable to this week, whether it's adding Clyde Edwards-Helaire or Zamir White. I started last week's show with Ty Chandler, about adding him off the waiver wire. But he's a special case. I need to repeat this transaction because his week 15 was very, very impactful. He took over for Alexander Mattison as Minnesota's lead back against Cincinnati. He saw a 96% running back rush share and a 12.5% target share in that game. He scored about 25 PPR points. Now, why it took this long for the Vikings to feature Ty Chandler, I have no idea. As someone who touted Chandler at the start of the season, yeah, it's kind of frustrating, I'm not going to lie. But it's pretty clear that his performance against Cincy, it should mean that he's going to see more work over the next couple of weeks, even if Madison is back and healthy in week 16. I don't know if that's going to be the case, though. According to Dr. Edwin Porras, Madison seems more likely to come back in week 17 than week 16. That would mean another week of Ty Chandler being this team's lead back. Add Dontavian Wicks. I've talked about Dontavian Wicks quite a bit over the last month and a half on this show. He's had a really, really underrated rookie season. He's leading that Packers team right now in yards per route run. Without Christian Watson this past week against Tampa Bay, Wicks ran the second most routes at wide receiver for the Packers. He had a 19.4% target share. He caught 6 of 7 balls for 97 yards. Now, something else happened in that game to help Wicks out, and that was a Jaden Reed injury that happened at the beginning of the fourth quarter. His status right now, totally up in the air. So is Christian Watson's. But both of those injuries could mean a lot of Dontavian Wicks in week 16. So I would add him just in case. Add Tucker Kraft. So another Packers pass catcher who's benefiting from these injuries is Tucker Kraft. Kraft is basically just playing the Luke Musgrave role in this Packers offense. You could argue he's doing a better job at it. He's now seen target shares of 17%, 11%, and 17% over his last 3. He scored double-digit PPR points in each of his last 2. So given the injury question marks around this Green Bay Packers passing attack, Kraft could walk into a 15% target share here in week 16 pretty easily. That's enough to be usable in fantasy football at tight end. Add Curtis Samuel. Another player that I've talked about a lot this season on this show, Curtis Samuel, man. He's been getting it done for a lot of the season, and fantasy managers just don't seem to care. He's still out there in 63% of Yahoo leagues, despite a 25.5% target share per game rate over his last 3. Now, the Commanders have a tough couple of weeks coming up. They get the Jets and then the 49ers. But the Jets have allowed a top 5 target share to the slot this season. Samuel could see 6 or 7 targets in that matchup. And the Commanders are likely to be a pass-heavy team in week 17 when they get the 49ers. So given how he's performed this season, I think he's definitely worth an add. Drop Sam Howell. Now look, Sam Howell has had a great season from a value perspective. He was drafted as an afterthought in most fantasy drafts this year. And he's basically been a low-end QB1, high-end QB2 in points per game. He's been a nice value. But in a lot of formats right now, you can probably drop him. Howell was benched in week 15. It does sound like the Commanders are going to go back to him in week 16, but him being benched, not a great sign. This week, Howell's going to get the Jets. New York has been the toughest matchup for quarterbacks this season by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Chances are you're not going to feel great about Sam Howell here in week 16. And chances are, from a probability standpoint, from a projection standpoint, Sam Howell's not going to have a great game against the Jets. And then in week 17, he gets San Francisco. That's the 4th toughest matchup for quarterbacks when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now look, when the season's done, we might look back and say that Sam Howell had 2 great weeks against the Jets and the 49ers. This isn't about looking in hindsight, though. We're projecting. And from a projection standpoint, starting Howell in the semifinals and then the finals with those two matchups, that's a frightening thing to do. Add Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson. So Zach Moss was injured in Week 15 against the Steelers, and that led to a backfield tandem of Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson for the Colts. Sermon ended up out-snapping Goodson 28-18. He saw 17 carries. Goodson had 11. Goodson, though, was targeted twice, while Sermon didn't have a single target. There's a lot of uncertainty right now when looking at this Colts backfield. It sounds like Zach Moss wants to go in Week 16, but Jonathan Taylor, he could also be back. But we can't just sit and wait and see what happens. We have to act earlier in the week with the information that we have. So adding these guys makes some sense. And I think the player that you want to add from the backfield, in my opinion, of course, is Trey Sermon. If both Taylor and Moss are out, Sermon's likely to see more work in that offense after playing more snaps against Pittsburgh. And even though Goodson had more work as a receiver, Sermon actually ran more routes. He was getting more usage overall. But again, you're going to want to read reports. It's very possible that both Jonathan Taylor and Zach Moss are back this week, or that one of them's back. And if one of them plays, then these backup running backs, they're not going to be very useful in fantasy football. But for now, we're going to add Sermon, and maybe in deeper formats, add Goodson. Add Josh Palmer. So Josh Palmer finally returned to the field in Week 15, and his end-of-game stat line, it actually looked pretty good. He caught 4 of 4 targets for 113 yards and a touchdown. He scored over 21 PPR points. Now, the bad news from that game with Palmer is that his target share was only 13%. He outperformed expectation based on that target share. The good news, though, is that he was second on the Chargers in routes run. And then on top of that, Keenan Allen's banged up. Josh Palmer could very easily see that target share shift upward here in Week 16. The bad news is that the Chargers are terrible, and Easton Stick is his quarterback. I think you could do worse than Josh Palmer off the waiver wire, but I don't think he's going to be an easy player to use. But that's kind of the case for most waiver wire wide receivers. Add Justice Hill. So unfortunately, the explosive rookie Keaton Mitchell, he suffered a really gruesome injury on Sunday night. Let's hope that he can get back and be his awesome explosive self in 2024. In 2023, though, we're looking at a Ravens backfield from here on out with Gus Edwards and Justice Hill. We have a sample of this backfield with just those two backs. And it basically went like this. Gus Edwards saw more early down work and he saw more goal line work. But then Justice Hill was the team's primary pass catcher. Hill was averaging roughly a 10% target share per game rate earlier this season when Edwards was his primary competition. Now, I will say that part of the intrigue with Justice Hill is that he's been the hurry-up guy throughout this 2023 season. According to Fantasy Life's utilization report, Hill's played 76% of the team's 2-minute snaps this year. Edwards is at 13%. When Baltimore's trailing, Justice Hill is on the field. And that could be important over their next 2 games. They get the 49ers and the Dolphins. Those are 2 very good teams. Edwards is rostered in way too many leagues to be referenced on today's show. But Justice Hill is still out there in 87% of Yahoo leagues. He definitely needs to be added this week. Drop Dameon Pierce. Now look, I've talked about it being handcuffing season, and Dameon Pierce, technically kind of a handcuff. So this transaction is not necessarily a must. It's just that if there are better handcuffs out there on your waiver wire, maybe like a Chase Brown type, I'd rather have that player than Dameon Pierce. The Texans' backfield is just kind of unpredictable. Over the last 2 weeks, though, Pierce has seen 5 total rush attempts. Devin Singletary's been the guy. That means that you're not playing Dameon Pierce in Week 16. And let's just pretend that he gets a bigger workload here in Week 16. Let's pretend that they use him more in this game. Are you going to actually use him in Week 17 against the Titans? Are you going to feel that confident throwing him in your starting lineup? Again, from a handcuffing standpoint, fine. You can keep Dameon Pierce around. The idea here, though, is that there are probably better handcuffs on your waiver wire. Even when Pierce was seeing a bigger workload earlier this season, he wasn't showing that much upside. And Houston's matchups just aren't ideal over the next 2 weeks. Add Demario Douglas. Look, I've talked a lot about Douglas this season too, and I really can't comprehend why he's still available in almost 80% of Yahoo leagues. He's averaged a target share per game rate of 23% over his last 6 games. Now, he still hasn't found the end zone this season. Maybe that's the reason why he's on the waiver wire, because there's not that much upside with Douglas. But there are plenty of teams out there who could use cheap PPR production. That's exactly what Demario Douglas gives you. Add Hunter Henry. Hunter Henry is ranked as a top 5 tight end in back-to-back weeks. Both of those games came with Bailey Zappi under center for New England. His performance 2 weeks ago, a little bit fluky. He only had an 11.5% target share. That's not very high. But he followed that up this past week with a 29% target share against the Chiefs. He's now scored 19 plus PPR points in back-to-back games. The Patriots have used Henry more over the last month and a half. His route participation has been about 13 percentage points higher than it was during the first half of the season. Now you take that route participation and you combine it with his target share from week 15, yeah, he could be usable down the stretch over the next 2 weeks of the fantasy football season. And New England, for the record, has the 3rd best 2-week schedule for tight ends, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. Add Joe Flacco. So one of the great things about Flacco in this Browns offense is that he's not afraid to throw it deep. Flacco's now started 3 games, and in those games, he's had average depth of targets of 11.5, 7.1, and 9.1. That's according to Fantasy Life. His 9.2 ADOT is half a yard higher than Deshaun Watson's was. It's more than a full yard higher than the other backups in that offense. Now, Flacco's averaged 17.8 points per game in his 3 starts, but it should be noted that he's faced 3 top half matchups by adjusted points allowed. Here's the thing though, in week 16, Cleveland gets Houston. The Texans rank as the 6th most favorable matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. So this week, I don't mind Joe Flacco as a streamer, as crazy as that sounds in the year 2023. Add Tyler Boyd. Jamar Chase has a shot to miss some time with this shoulder injury. That can and it will push about 26-27% of Cincinnati's targets around that offense. And one player who could benefit is Tyler Boyd. Now, I understand that Tyler Boyd doesn't play the same type of wide receiver that Jamar Chase plays. They're not the same type of receiver at all. But in week 16, he gets the Steelers. Pittsburgh's been arguably the worst team in football against slot players this year. They've given up by far the highest yards per route run to slot players. And Boyd's lined up in the slot on 85% of his snaps this season. So even a small increase in target share for Boyd could make him worthwhile here in week 16. And he's still out there in over half of Yahoo leagues. Add Michael Wilson. So Michael Wilson saw his first action since week 10 this past weekend, and he didn't do a whole lot. He failed to record a catch. He only had 3 targets. It was a 7.9% target share. That's not great. But here's the good news. Michael Wilson ran a route on 88% of Arizona's dropbacks. And Marquise Brown is dealing with this heel injury. You may not be able to trust Wilson in week 16, but let's say that he shows up. Let's say he has a good game. In week 17, he gets a very favorable matchup against Philadelphia. In deeper leagues, you might be able to use him. Add the Denver Broncos defense. There are so many quarterback injuries across the league, it's not that difficult to find a streaming defense. There's a lot of them out there. I'm calling out the Broncos here, though, because not only do they get New England this week, but then they get LA, the Chargers, in week 17. Denver's a 6-point home favorite this weekend in a game, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, that has a 34.5-point over-under. And then Easton Stick, more than likely, is going to be starting for LA next week against Denver. And Denver, as a unit, has played much better defensively during the second half of the season. I know they had a tough week 15 against a good offense in Detroit, but they'd finished as a top 6 defense in fantasy football in 5 of their 6 games prior to that contest. You can probably ride the Denver Broncos defense through the end of the season. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB, and make sure you're following Late Round Fantasy Football on Instagram @LateRoundFF, and then make sure you're subscribed to YouTube at youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks everyone. Talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends episode.